Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we begin today's attack report, I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel. Your support is very important to us, so please subscribe. Go ahead and leave a comment telling me which city you're watching from, and click the like button. All of this because... The moment I stepped onto the trail, the crisp autumn air filled my lungs, invigorating me with its sharp, clean scent. It was early October, and the Adirondack Mountains were a tapestry of reds, oranges, and golds. I'd been planning this solo hike for months, eager to challenge myself and soak in the raw beauty of nature before winter set in. I adjusted my backpack, double-checking that I had everything I needed: water, trail mix, first aid kit, map, and compass. The weight was reassuring on my shoulders as I set off, my boots crunching on the leaf-strewn path. For the first hour, the hike was everything I'd hoped for. The trail wound through dense forest, occasionally opening up to reveal breathtaking vistas of the surrounding peaks. I paused often, drinking in the scenery and snapping photos with my phone. "This is perfect," I murmured to myself, smiling as a cool breeze rustled the leaves overhead. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself pushing harder, determined to reach the summit before nightfall. The trail became steeper, more challenging, but I welcomed the burn in my muscles. I was so focused on my goal that I barely noticed the gradual change in the forest around me. It wasn't until I stopped to catch my breath and take a swig of water that I realized how quiet it had become. The cheerful birdsong that had accompanied me earlier had faded away, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. I glanced at my watch, surprised to see it was later than I thought. The sun was sinking lower, its rays slanting through the trees at an angle that transformed the familiar forest into something different. I shook off the growing unease and pressed on, picking up my pace. That's when I heard it, a sharp crack behind me, like a twig snapping under a heavy foot. I whirled around, my heart suddenly pounding. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding thin and weak in the stillness. "Is someone there?" No response. Just the whisper of wind through the leaves and the rapid thud of my own pulse in my ears. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. "Get it together," I muttered. "It's probably just a deer or something." But as I turned to continue up the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The shadows seemed to deepen with each step, stretching and twisting into shapes that made my imagination run wild. Every tree trunk became a lurking figure, every rustling bush a potential threat. I picked up my pace, no longer stopping to admire the view or catch my breath. The beautiful fall colors that had enchanted me earlier now seemed ominous, as if the forest itself was cloaked in blood and fire. The setting sun cast long shadows that danced and shifted, transforming familiar shapes into menacing silhouettes. "It's just your imagination," I told myself firmly, even as my steps quickened. "There's nothing out here but trees and rocks and..." I broke off as a gust of wind swept through the forest, carrying with it a scent that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was musky, wild, and undeniably animal, but not like any animal I'd encountered before. An eerie silence fell over the forest, as if nature itself was holding its breath. No birds, no insects, not even the whisper of wind through leaves. Just a heavy, waiting stillness that pressed against my eardrums like a physical force. I fumbled for my phone, intending to check my location on the trail map app I'd downloaded. But as the screen lit up, my stomach dropped. No signal. And worse, the little blue dot that should have shown my position was nowhere near the marked trail. My heart raced as I realized I had strayed far from the marked path. How long had I been off course? In my haste to outrun the encroaching darkness, both literal and imagined, I must have missed a turn somewhere. "Okay, don't panic," I said aloud, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. "Just retrace your steps. Find the trail. You can do this." I turned in a slow circle, trying to orient myself. But in the fading light, every direction looked the same, an endless sea of trees and shadows. The landmarks I'd so carefully noted on the way up were nowhere to be seen. A trickle of sweat ran down my back despite the chill in the air. I was lost. Really, truly lost in a vast wilderness as night was falling. Those eyes, now fully visible, held no mercy, no understanding. Only hunger. "This isn't real," I whispered, backing away slowly. "This can't be happening." The creature's muscles tensed, and I knew it was about to pounce. In that moment, time seemed to slow down. I could see every detail with horrifying clarity. The saliva dripping from its jaws, the way its claws dug into the earth, the moonlight glinting off its yellowed fangs. Then it threw back its head and howled. The sound pierced the night, paralyzing me with primal fear. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Part wolf, part scream, and entirely terrifying. The howl seemed to reach into my very soul, awakening an ancient, instinctual dread. As the echoes of the howl faded, the spell of paralysis broke. I ran. I ran blindly through the forest, branches whipping my face as I fled. I had no plan, no destination, just an overwhelming need to put as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. "Help!" I screamed, knowing it was futile. "Somebody, please help me!" Only the sound of my own ragged breathing and the creature's pursuit answered me. I could hear it crashing through the underbrush behind me, gaining ground with each passing second. A root caught my foot and I went sprawling. Pain shot through my ankle as I scrambled to get up. In that moment of vulnerability, I was certain it was over. I turned, expecting to see jaws closing in on me. Instead, I saw a steep slope leading down into darkness. Without thinking, I threw myself over the edge. I tumbled down the hillside, a chaotic blur of pain and disorientation. Rocks and branches battered me as I rolled, unable to control my descent. When I finally came to a stop at the bottom, I lay there gasping, every part of me aching. "Get up," I wheezed to myself. "Get up. You have to move." Somehow, I staggered to my feet. My clothes were torn, and I could feel warm blood trickling from various cuts and scrapes. But I was alive. I listened intently, trying to hear over the pounding of my heart. No howls, no growls, no sound of pursuit. Had I lost it? A splash made me jump, and I realized I was standing at the edge of a fast-moving stream. The water glinted in the moonlight, and an idea formed through my panic-addled thoughts. "Water," I muttered. "It'll lose my scent." Without further hesitation, I waded into the icy current. The cold shocked me, nearly taking my breath away, but I pushed on. The stream was deeper than I'd anticipated, soon reaching my chest. I let the water carry me downstream, fighting to keep my head above the surface. Branches and rocks hidden beneath the dark water battered me, but I didn't dare leave the relative safety of the current. How long I drifted, I couldn't say. Time lost all meaning in the struggle to stay afloat, and the constant fear of hearing that howl again. Eventually the stream widened and slowed, and I managed to drag myself onto the bank. I lay there on the muddy shore, shivering violently, every muscle screaming in protest. But I was alive. Somehow, impossibly, I was alive. As the adrenaline began to fade, the reality of my situation started to sink in. I was lost, injured, and soaking wet in the middle of nowhere. And somewhere out there, that creature was still hunting. "What the hell was that thing?" I whispered, my teeth chattering. My mind raced through possibilities, each more outlandish than the last. A bear? No, it stood on two legs and was far too large. Some kind of mutant wolf? But those eyes, that face, it had been almost human. A word bubbled up from the depths of my consciousness, a term I'd only encountered in movies and campfire stories. But I pushed it away. That was impossible. Those things didn't exist in the real world. Did they? I forced myself to sit up, wincing at the various aches and pains making themselves known. I needed to find help, to get back to civilization. But the forest around me was utterly unfamiliar, and I had no idea which direction would lead me to safety. A twig snapped in the darkness and I froze. Was it back? Had it somehow tracked me here? "Hello?" I called out, my voice hoarse and trembling. "Is someone there?" No answer came, but I could feel eyes on me again. That same sense of being hunted that had preceded the creature's appearance before. I stumbled to my feet, ignoring the protests of my battered body. I couldn't stay here. I had to keep moving. As I limped into the trees, trying to put distance between myself and the water's edge, one thought kept repeating in my mind. This night is far from over. My legs burned with exhaustion as I pushed myself forward through the dense undergrowth. Every nerve in my body screamed for rest, but the primal fear coursing through my veins wouldn't let me stop, not when I could hear it behind me. Heavy footfalls pounded the forest floor, getting closer with each passing second. The creature's breathing was ragged and hungry, a sound that chilled me to my very core. It was gaining on me, and fast. Come on," I gasped, willing my battered body to move faster. The forest was a blur of shadows and obstacles. Branches whipped at my face and arms, leaving stinging cuts in their wake. My clothes, still damp from the stream, clung to me uncomfortably, hampering my movement. I risked a glance over my shoulder, and immediately regretted it. In the dim moonlight filtering through the canopy, I caught a glimpse of the monster. Its yellow eyes gleamed with predatory focus, fixed solely on me. The sight sent a fresh surge of adrenaline through my system. "Help!" I screamed, knowing it was futile, but unable to stop myself. "Somebody, please!" My cries were swallowed by the night, answered only by the sound of pursuit growing ever closer. I stumbled over roots and rocks, terror propelling me forward. My ankle, injured in the earlier fall, protested with each step. But stopping wasn't an option. Stopping meant death. The forest seemed to be working against me. Every direction I turned presented new obstacles: fallen trees, thorny bushes, sudden drops in the terrain. I was running blind, with no idea where I was going or what lay ahead. "Please," I whimpered, not even sure who or what I was pleading to. "Please, let me get out of this." A low branch caught me across the chest, knocking the wind out of me. I staggered, struggling to regain my balance and momentum. That momentary slowdown was all it needed. Suddenly, I felt hot breath on my neck, telling me the beast was mere inches away. The musky, wild scent I'd noticed earlier now filled my nostrils, overwhelming in its intensity. I could practically feel the creature's presence looming over me. "No!" I cried out, ducking and weaving in a desperate attempt to throw it off. For a brief moment I thought I'd succeeded. Then a searing pain shot through my leg as claws raked across my calf. The agony was immediate and intense, unlike anything I'd ever experienced. I screamed, the sound tearing from my throat in a primal shriek of pain and terror. The attack threw me off balance, sending me stumbling forward. I flailed, trying to catch myself, but the ground suddenly disappeared beneath my feet. I was falling. I tumbled down a steep embankment, the world spinning around me. Rocks and branches battered my body as I rolled uncontrollably down the slope. I caught glimpses of the night sky, then earth, then sky again in a dizzying whirl. When I finally came to a stop at the bottom, I lay there gasping, every part of me screaming in pain. My vision swam, and for a moment I thought I might pass out. The coppery taste of blood filled my mouth. "Get up," I wheezed to myself. "You have to get up." Gritting my teeth against the pain, I forced myself to my feet. My injured leg nearly buckled under me, and I had to lean against a nearby tree for support. Warm blood trickled down my calf, soaking into my sock. I looked back up the embankment, expecting to see the creature bearing down on me, but the slope was empty. Had I lost it in the fall? A twig snapped somewhere to my left, and I whirled toward the sound, heart pounding. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking. Silence answered me, but I could feel eyes on me. It was still out there, watching, waiting. The hunt wasn't over. I limped forward, each step sending jolts of pain through my injured leg. I had no idea where I was going, but staying in one place wasn't an option. I had to find help, had to get out of these godforsaken woods. As I moved, my mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. What was that thing? How could it exist? The word werewolf kept surfacing in my thoughts, but I pushed it away. That was impossible, wasn't it? A howl pierced the night closer than I'd expected. I quickened my pace, ignoring the protests of my battered body. The sound was filled with a mixture of frustration and hunger that made my blood run cold. "This isn't real," I muttered to myself as I stumbled through the underbrush. "This can't be happening. Wake up, wake up." But the pain in my leg, the ache in my muscles, the fear coursing through my veins, it was all too real. This was no nightmare I could wake up from. I don't know how long I wandered through the darkness, constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every sound. Time lost all meaning in the face of sheer survival. My only goal was to keep moving, to put as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. Eventually, I broke through a line of trees and found myself on the edge of a small clearing. In the center stood a structure, a cabin, old and weathered, but unmistakably man-made. "Oh, thank God," I breathed, relief washing over me. I limped towards the cabin as quickly as I could manage, praying it wasn't abandoned. As I got closer, I saw a faint light flickering in one of the windows. Someone was home. Just as I reached the porch steps, another howl split the night. It was close, too close. I whirled around, scanning the tree line frantically. There, at the edge of the clearing, I saw it. The creature stood on its hind legs, its massive form silhouetted against the darkness of the forest. Those yellow eyes gleamed with malevolent intelligence, fixed directly on me. For a moment we stared at each other, predator and prey, separated by mere yards of open ground. Then it tensed, preparing to charge. I turned and threw myself at the cabin door, pounding with all my might. "Help!" I screamed. "Please, let me in. It's coming." As I heard heavy footfalls racing across the clearing behind me, I silently prayed that whoever was inside would open the door in time. My heart pounded in my ears as I threw myself against the cabin door, praying it would open. Just as I heard the creature's heavy footfalls closing in behind me, the door gave way. I stumbled inside, my injured leg nearly buckling beneath me. "Oh, thank God," I gasped, slamming the door shut and fumbling with the lock. It was only then that I realized the cabin was empty. No furniture, no signs of life, just bare walls and dust-covered floors. "Hello?" I called out weakly, confused by the absence of the person I'd seen through the window. Had I imagined the light? A thunderous impact against the door made me jump. The whole cabin seemed to shudder. I limped away from the entrance, my eyes darting around for anything I could use to barricade it. Scratching and snarling outside the walls made the whole structure tremble. The sound was deafening, a cacophony of rage and hunger that chilled me to my core. "This isn't happening," I muttered, my voice shaking. "This can't be real," but the pain in my leg told a different story. I looked down, noticing for the first time how badly I was hurt. Blood seeped through my torn jeans, leaving a trail of crimson droplets on the dusty floor. I limped further into the cabin, frantically searching for a weapon, anything I could use to defend myself. The monster outside redoubled its efforts, throwing itself against the walls and door. Each impact sent shockwaves through the old structure, and I feared it wouldn't hold for long. Come on," I whispered, rummaging through empty drawers and cupboards. There has to be something. My search turned up little: a rusty hammer, some moldy rope, a few empty bottles. I gripped the hammer tightly, knowing it was woefully inadequate against the beast outside, but needing something, anything, to make me feel less helpless. A moment of relative quiet fell, and for a second, I dared to hope the creature had given up. Then I heard a new sound, sniffing followed by a low growl that seemed to come from above. I looked up just in time to see a massive shape hurl itself at the cabin's single window. The glass shattered in a deafening crash, and a huge clawed paw swiped through the opening. "No!" I screamed, stumbling backward and tripping over my own feet. I fell hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. The creature's arm withdrew, only to be replaced by its head. Those yellow eyes locked onto me, filled with a predatory hunger that left no doubt about its intentions. Its jaws, lined with razor-sharp teeth, snapped at the air as it tried to force its way through the too small opening. I scrambled backward on hands and knees, leaving smears of blood on the floor. My back hit the far wall, and I realized with growing horror that I was trapped. There was nowhere left to run. The beast withdrew from the window, and for a moment, silence fell. Then came a sound that made my blood run cold. Wood splintering. It was breaking through the wall. I cowered in the corner, certain these were my final moments. Tears streamed down my face as I gripped the hammer in trembling hands. "Please," I whimpered, not even sure who or what I was pleading to. "Please, someone help me." The wall to my right exploded inward in a shower of splinters and dust. Through the haze, I saw the creature force its way into the cabin. It was even more terrifying up close, easily 8 feet tall with matted fur, rippling muscles, and those terrible, intelligent eyes. It advanced on me slowly, savoring its victory. I raised the hammer, a pitiful defense against this monster. "Stay back!" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. "Don't come any closer." The beast's mouth opened in what almost looked like a grin, revealing rows of yellowed fangs. It raised one massive paw, claws extended, ready to strike. I closed my eyes, bracing for the killing blow. In that moment, a lifetime of regrets flashed through my mind. Things I'd never done, people I'd never see again. I thought of my family, how they'd never know what happened to me. The sound of a gunshot shattered the night. My eyes flew open to see the creature recoil, snarling in pain and rage. Another shot rang out, and another. The beast whirled toward the new threat, momentarily forgetting about me. Through the broken wall, I saw a figure silhouetted against the night sky. An old man, his face lined with age and fear, held a rifle trained on the monster. "Get away from them, you bastard," the old man shouted, firing again. The creature let out a bone-chilling howl of fury and pain. It glanced back at me, then at the old man as if weighing its options. Another shot decided for it. With a final, hate-filled look in my direction, it bounded out of the cabin and disappeared into the night. I sat there, frozen in shock and disbelief, as the old man rushed to my side. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gruff but tinged with concern. "Can you stand?" I nodded mutely, allowing him to help me to my feet. My legs felt like jelly, and I leaned heavily on him for support. "We need to get out of here," the old man said urgently. "That thing might come back. My truck's not far." As he guided me out of the ruined cabin, I found my voice. What was that?" I asked, my words barely above a whisper. The old man's expression darkened. "Something that shouldn't exist," he replied grimly. "Come on, we need to move. I'll explain what I can once we're safe." We stumbled into the night, leaving behind the destroyed cabin. As we made our way through the dark forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that those yellow eyes were still watching us, waiting for another chance to strike. The night was far from over, and I had a sinking feeling that my ordeal was only beginning. The creature's massive form filled the doorway, its yellow eyes locked on me with murderous intent. I was certain these were my final moments. Then suddenly, the night exploded with sound. Gunshots rang out, sharp cracks that shattered the silence. The beast's howls, which had been filled with rage and hunger, suddenly turned to pain. It whirled around, facing this new threat, momentarily forgetting about me. A gruff voice shouted from outside, "Get away from there, you son of a bitch!" More shots followed, and I could see the creature flinching with each impact. It let out a bone-chilling roar, a sound of fury and frustration. For a moment, it seemed torn between finishing me off and dealing with this new attacker. "That's right, you bastard," the voice yelled again. "Come and get me." The monster hesitated for just a second longer, then bounded out of the cabin with incredible speed. I heard more gunshots, followed by the sound of something large crashing through the underbrush, moving away from us. I sat there, frozen in shock and disbelief, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. The silence that followed was almost as deafening as the gunfire had been. Suddenly, heavy footsteps approached the cabin. I tensed, fear gripping me anew. What if it was back? The door burst open and a man rushed in. He was older, probably in his 60s, with a weathered face and wild gray hair. In his hands, he clutched a rifle, his knuckles white from gripping it so tightly. His eyes darted around the cabin, finally settling on me huddled in the corner. "You all right, kid?" he asked, his voice gruff but tinged with concern. I tried to speak, but no words came out. I just stared at him, still not quite believing he was real. The old man's eyes widened as he took in my condition, the blood, the torn clothes, the look of sheer terror on my face. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. Then more urgently, "We need to move now." He crossed the room quickly, reaching down to pull me to my feet. I winced as pain shot through my injured leg, nearly collapsing again. "Whoa there," he said, catching me. "Can you walk?" I nodded weakly, finding my voice at last. I think so. What was that thing?" The old man's face darkened. "No time for explanations now. We gotta get out of here before it comes back." He helped me limp towards the door, one arm around my waist for support. As we stepped outside, the cool night air hit me, and I realized how close I'd come to death. The forest loomed around us, dark and menacing. "My truck's not far," the old man said. "Think you can make it?" I nodded again, gritting my teeth against the pain. We set off into the night, moving as quickly as my injured leg would allow. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every rustle of leaves made me flinch. "Name's Frank," the old man said as we walked, his eyes constantly scanning our surroundings. "What's yours?" "Alex," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "Well, Alex, you picked one hell of a night for a hike," Frank said, a hint of grim humor in his tone. We pushed on through the darkness, the adrenaline slowly fading from my system. The pain in my leg was getting worse, and I could feel warm blood still seeping from the wounds. "Almost there," Frank encouraged. "Just a little further." A twig snapped somewhere behind us, and we both froze. Frank raised his rifle, peering into the darkness. Long seconds ticked by as we waited, hardly daring to breathe. Finally, Frank lowered the gun slightly. "Probably just a deer," he muttered, but he didn't sound convinced. We pressed on, moving faster now. I bit back a cry of pain with each step, fear driving me forward. In the distance, I heard a faint howl. It was far off, but the sound chilled me to my core. "There she is," Frank said suddenly, gesturing ahead. Through the trees, I could make out the shape of an old pickup truck. It was the most beautiful sight I'd ever seen. Just as we reached the vehicle, another howl split the night. This one was much closer. "Get in," Frank shouted, practically shoving me into the passenger seat. He ran around to the driver's side, jumping in and fumbling with his keys. The engine roared to life just as I saw movement at the edge of the tree line. Yellow eyes gleamed in the darkness, and I could make out the massive shape of the creature emerging from the forest. "Go! Go! Go!" I yelled, panic rising in my throat. Frank slammed the truck into gear and we took off, tires spinning in the dirt. I looked in the side mirror and saw the beast bound after us for a few yards before giving up the chase. As we sped down the dirt road, putting distance between us and that nightmare, I finally allowed myself to believe I might survive this night. What was that thing?" I asked, my voice shaking. Frank was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. When he finally spoke, his words sent a chill down my spine. "Something that shouldn't exist," he said grimly. "Something I'd hoped never to see again." I turned to look at him, 1,000 questions on my lips, but the haunted look in his eyes stopped me. Whatever that creature was, Frank knew more about it than he was letting on. As we drove through the night, leaving the howls far behind us, I realized that my ordeal was far from over. I'd escaped with my life, but the mystery of what had attacked me and why Frank seemed to know about it was just beginning to unfold. The monster's howls faded behind us, but the memory of those yellow eyes and gleaming fangs would haunt me for a long time to come. I had a feeling that this night would change my life forever, in ways I couldn't even begin to imagine. Frank's ancient pickup truck rattled down a narrow, winding road deep into the heart of the Adirondacks. Every bump sent waves of pain through my injured leg, but I barely noticed. My mind was still reeling from the night's events, struggling to process what I'd seen and experienced. "Almost there," Frank grunted, his eyes constantly flicking between the road and the rearview mirror. I nodded silently, my own gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the headlights. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every rustle in the trees a potential attack. Finally, we pulled up to a small, weathered cabin nestled in a clearing. Frank cut the engine, and for a moment we sat in silence, listening to the night sounds around us. "Come on," he said at last, grabbing his rifle. "Let's get you inside and take a look at that leg." I limped after him, leaning heavily on his arm. The cabin was sparse but tidy, lit by the warm glow of kerosene lamps. Frank helped me to a worn armchair, then busied himself securing the door and windows. "You got lucky," he muttered, pulling curtains closed. "Most folks don't survive an encounter like that." A chill ran down my spine at his words. "You mean, you've seen that thing before?" Frank's face darkened, more times than I care to remember. He moved to a cabinet, pulling out a battered first aid kit. "Let's get you patched up." As Frank tended to my wounds, I couldn't help but notice how his hands shook. Whether from age or fear, I couldn't tell. He worked in silence for a while, cleaning and bandaging the deep gashes on my leg. "The curse," he muttered suddenly, so quietly I almost missed it. "What curse?" I asked. Frank shook his head, as if coming out of a trance. "Nothing. Just an old man's ramblings." A howl echoed in the distance, making us both jump. Frank's head snapped towards the window, his whole body tensing. "It's far off," he said, more to himself than to me. "We should be safe here. For now." "What is it, Frank?" I pressed. "What was that thing that attacked me?" He sighed heavily, suddenly looking every one of his years. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." "Try me," I said. "After what I've seen tonight, I'll believe just about anything." Frank was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant. When he spoke, his voice was low and haunted. "It's been here for generations. The old-timers used to talk about it in whispers. A beast that walks like a man, hunts like a wolf. Most folks wrote it off as campfire stories, but some of us knew the truth." Another howl, closer this time. We both flinched. "I was about your age when I first saw it," Frank continued. "Tore my best friend to shreds right in front of me. Been hunting it ever since, trying to put an end to the curse." "Curse?" I echoed, remembering his earlier mutterings. Frank nodded grimly. "Legend says it was a man once. Made a deal with the devil for power, but got more than he bargained for. Now he's trapped, half man, half beast, driven by an insatiable hunger." I shook my head, trying to process this information. "But that's impossible. Werewolves aren't real." "Tell that to your leg," Frank said, nodding towards my bandaged wounds. "Or to the families of all the folks who've gone missing in these woods over the years." A branch scraped against the cabin's roof, making us both start. Frank grabbed his rifle, moving to the window to peer out into the darkness. "How often does it hunt?" I asked, dreading the answer. "Used to be just during the full moon," Frank replied, his eyes never leaving the window. "But lately, it's been more frequent, more aggressive, like it's getting desperate." We fell into an uneasy silence after that, both lost in our own thoughts. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle from the forest outside, had us on edge. Sleep was out of the question. As the night wore on, Frank told me more about the attacks he'd witnessed over the years. Each tale was more chilling than the last. Hikers found torn to pieces, entire campsites decimated, search parties that went in and never came out. "Why haven't you told anyone?" I asked. "The authorities? The media?" Frank let out a bitter laugh. "You think I haven't tried? Nobody believes. Those that do, well, they tend to disappear." A sudden thud outside made us both freeze. Frank raised his rifle and I gripped the arms of my chair, heart pounding. Long seconds ticked by as we waited, hardly daring to breathe. Finally, a raccoon scurried past the window, and we both let out sighs of relief. "False alarm," Frank muttered, but he didn't lower his gun. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky, I felt some of the tension leave my body. We'd made it through the night. "What happens now?" I asked Frank. He was quiet for a moment, his face grim. Now we figure out how to end this. Once and for all." I nodded, a mix of fear and determination settling over me. I knew I should want to run, to get as far away from this nightmare as possible. But something in me had changed during that long, terrifying night. I couldn't just walk away, not when I knew what was out there. As the sun rose over the Adirondacks, casting long shadows through the trees, I realized that my ordeal was far from over. The beast was still out there, and it would hunt again. The question was, would we be the hunters or the hunted? Or, Frank's words echoed in my mind as we watched the new day dawn. The curse must be broken. Little did I know then just how high the cost of breaking that curse would be. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the cabin windows, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. We had survived the night, but the harsh light of day brought its own terrors. I shifted in the armchair, wincing as pain shot through my leg. The makeshift bandages Frank had applied were soaked through with blood. "Let's take a look at that," Frank said, his voice gruff with exhaustion. I nodded, slowly peeling back the bandages. The sight beneath made my stomach churn. Deep gashes ran across my calf, the flesh angry and swollen. It looked worse than I'd imagined. Frank's expression grew grim as he examined the claw marks. "This needs proper medical attention," he muttered. "My patching up won't cut it." "How bad is it?" I asked, dreading the answer. He shook his head. "Bad enough. We need to get you to a doctor and fast." The thought of leaving the relative safety of the cabin filled me with anxiety. But what if that thing is still out there? Frank's eyes hardened. "It's a risk we've got to take. That wound gets infected, you could lose the leg. Or worse." I swallowed hard, nodding. He was right, of course, but that didn't make the prospect any less terrifying. "There's a town about an hour's drive from here," Frank continued, moving to gather supplies. "We'll head there, get you patched up proper." As we prepared to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every rustle in the trees a potential attack. Frank's truck groaned to life, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet forest. As we pulled away from the cabin, I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see yellow eyes gleaming in the rearview mirror. The forest seemed to close in around us as we drove, the trees pressing close to the narrow road. Branches scratched against the truck's sides, like claws trying to hold us back. "You said there have been other attacks," I said, breaking the tense silence. "How come nobody knows about this? Why isn't it all over the news?" Frank's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Oh, there have been stories. Missing hikers, mutilated livestock. But folks around here, they don't like to talk about it. And those that do, well, they tend to be written off as crazy." I thought about how my own story would sound. A giant wolf man attacking me in the woods? Who would believe that? As if reading my thoughts, Frank added, "Best keep the details to yourself when we get to town. Say it was a bear attack or something. Trust me, it's easier that way." I nodded, understanding but not liking it. The idea of hiding the truth, of pretending this nightmare hadn't happened, didn't sit well with me. We drove on in silence for a while, the forest gradually thinning as we approached more populated areas. I was just starting to relax when a sound cut through the air, making my blood run cold. A howl, distant but unmistakable, echoed through the trees. Frank's foot pressed harder on the accelerator, the old truck protesting as it picked up speed. "It can't be," he muttered. not in daylight. But there it was again, closer this time. The beast was following us. Fear nipped at our heels as we raced down the winding road. Every bend, every patch of shadow seemed to hold the promise of ambush. "I thought it only hunted at night," I said, my voice shaking. Frank's face was grim. "It used to. Something's changed. It's getting bolder, more desperate." The howls were getting closer, a fact that seemed impossible given the speed we were traveling. My heart pounded in my chest, remembered terror flooding my system. Suddenly, a dark shape burst from the trees ahead, landing in the middle of the road. Frank swerved hard, the truck fishtailing on the gravel surface. We narrowly missed the creature, catching only a glimpse of matted fur and gleaming teeth as we sped past. "Hold on!" Frank shouted, fighting to keep control of the vehicle. We careened down the road, the beast's howls of frustration fading behind us. But the fear remained, a constant presence in the pit of my stomach. As we finally broke free of the forest, emerging onto a main road, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. We'd made it. For now. The town came into view, a collection of small buildings that had never looked so welcoming. Frank pulled up in front of a small medical clinic, the truck's brakes squealing in protest. "Let's get you inside," he said, helping me out of the vehicle. As we limped towards the clinic's entrance, I couldn't shake the feeling that our ordeal was far from over. The beast was still out there, growing bolder by the day. And somehow I knew our paths would cross again. The clinic door closed behind us, shutting out the forest and its horrors. But as a nurse rushed to help me, concern etched on her face, I realized that the real challenge was just beginning. How could I explain what had happened? Who would believe the truth? As I was led to an examination room, Frank's words echoed in my mind. "Best keep the details to yourself." But as I looked down at the savage claw marks on my leg, I wondered how long I could keep this secret. The fluorescent lights of the sheriff's office buzzed incessantly, adding to my growing headache. My leg throbbed beneath the fresh bandages, a constant reminder of the nightmare I'd endured. But as I sat across from Sheriff Harding, his skeptical gaze boring into me, I began to question my own sanity. "Let me get this straight," Sheriff Harding drawled, leaning back in his creaky chair. "You're saying a giant wolf man attacked you in the woods?" I swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how ridiculous it sounded. "I know it sounds crazy, but—" "Crazy doesn't begin to cover it, son," the sheriff interrupted. His eyes narrowed. "You sure you weren't just hitting the bottle a little too hard out there?" "I wasn't drunk," I insisted, frustration creeping into my voice. "I know what I saw." Sheriff Harding sighed, rubbing his temples. "Look, we get a lot of bear attacks up here. Hikers who aren't prepared, who don't take proper precautions. It's unfortunate, but it happens." "It wasn't a bear," I said firmly. "It was walking on two legs. It had yellow eyes and—" "Werewolves ain't real, son." The sheriff cut me off, his tone final. "Now I can file a report about a bear attack if you want, but I'm not about to go chasing fairy tales in the woods." I looked to Frank for support, but he just shook his head slightly, a warning in his eyes. I remembered his advice about keeping the details to myself, but I couldn't just let this go. "Sheriff, please." Frank spoke up, his voice gravelly with urgency. "I've lived in these parts for decades. I've seen things you wouldn't believe. This creature, it's real, and it's dangerous." Sheriff Harding's expression softened slightly as he regarded the older man. "Frank, I've known you a long time. You're a good man, but, well, folks talk. They say you've gone a bit." He tapped his temple meaningfully. Frank's face fell, and I felt a surge of anger on his behalf. "He's not crazy," I insisted. "We both saw it. It chased us on the road coming into town." The sheriff's eyebrows shot up. "It chased you? In broad daylight? On the main road?" He shook his head. "Now I know you're pulling my leg." I opened my mouth to argue further, but Frank's hand on my arm stopped me. "Thank you for your time, Sheriff," he said, standing up. "We'll be going now." As we left the sheriff's office, I couldn't shake the feeling of defeat. We can't just give up. I hissed to Frank. "That thing is still out there." "Keep your voice down," Frank muttered, glancing around nervously. We stepped out onto the main street of the small town, and I immediately felt the weight of curious stares. Word had clearly spread fast about the crazy hikers with their wild stories. Whispers followed us as we made our way down the sidewalk. "There they are," I heard someone murmur. "The ones who saw the werewolf. Probably just some city folk who can't handle the woods." Another voice scoffed. I hunched my shoulders, trying to make myself smaller. The disbelief, the judgment in their eyes, it was almost worse than facing the creature again. "Don't let it get to you," Frank said softly. "We know the truth." But did we? As we walked, doubt began to creep into my mind. The events of the past night seemed increasingly surreal in the harsh light of day. Had it all been some kind of stress-induced hallucination? A nightmare born of fear and exhaustion? We stopped at a small diner, needing food and a moment to regroup. As we slid into a booth, I caught sight of our reflections in the window. We looked haggard, wild-eyed, exactly like the kind of people who'd make up stories about monsters in the woods. "What do we do now?" I asked Frank, my voice low. He sighed, suddenly looking every one of his years. "I don't know, kid. I've been fighting this battle for decades and—" He trailed off, shaking his head. A waitress approached, eyeing us warily. "What can I get you fellas?" "Just coffee, please," Frank replied. As she walked away, I leaned in close. "We can't just do nothing. That thing is still out there. It'll kill again." "And who's going to believe us?" Frank countered. "You saw how the sheriff reacted. We've got no proof, no evidence." He was right, of course. The creature had disappeared without a trace, leaving only my injuries as testament to its existence. And even those could be explained away as a bear attack or a bad fall. "There has to be something we can do," I insisted, but my own voice lacked conviction. Frank was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with resignation. Maybe it's time to let it go. We tried to warn them. That's all we can do." I wanted to argue, to insist that we keep fighting, but as I looked around the diner at the normal people living their normal lives, I felt a wave of exhaustion wash over me. How could we possibly make them understand the horror we'd faced? As we finished our coffee in silence, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were giving up, abandoning the fight. But what choice did we have? No one believed us. We had no way to prove what we'd seen. We left the diner, stepping back out onto the sunlit street. Everything looked so ordinary, so safe. It was hard to believe that just hours ago we'd been running for our lives from a creature out of nightmares. "What now?" I asked Frank as we stood on the sidewalk, uncertain. He sighed heavily. "Now we try to move on, try to forget." But as we walked down the street, the weight of disbelief and doubt pressing down on us, I knew that forgetting wasn't an option. The memory of those yellow eyes, that bone-chilling howl, it would haunt me forever. And deep down, a part of me knew that this wasn't over. The beast was still out there waiting. And someday, somehow, our paths would cross again. The afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. Despite the warmth of the day, a chill ran down my spine as Frank's truck rumbled down the dirt road leading back into the woods. Every fiber of my being screamed that this was a bad idea, yet I couldn't shake the compulsion to return. "You sure about this, kid?" Frank asked, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Ain't nothing good waiting for us back there?" I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the throbbing in my bandaged leg. "I need to see it, Frank. I need to know it was real." He nodded grimly, understanding in his eyes. The rifle lay across his lap, a constant reminder of the danger we were willingly walking into. As we neared the site of my attack, the forest seemed to press in around us. The cheerful bird song that had accompanied our drive faded away, replaced by an eerie silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that the trees themselves were watching us, hiding ancient secrets in their depths. Frank pulled the truck to a stop. "This is as far as we go by vehicle. We'll have to hoof it from here." We stepped out, the crunch of leaves under our feet sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. Frank checked his rifle, the click of the safety coming off echoing through the trees. "Stay close," he muttered, "and keep your eyes peeled." We moved slowly through the underbrush, every snapping twig and rustling leaf setting my nerves on edge. The forest, which had seemed so inviting just days ago, now felt alien and hostile. "There," I said suddenly, pointing to a clearing ahead. That's where it happened. As we entered the small open space, my breath caught in my throat. Signs of struggle were everywhere. Broken branches, churned earth, and dark stains that I tried not to think too hard about. "Look," Frank said, gesturing to a nearby tree. Deep gouges marred the trunk, far too high and too large to have been made by any normal animal. I ran my fingers over the marks, feeling the rough edges. "It was real," I whispered, a mix of relief and renewed terror washing over me. We continued our search, and it wasn't long before I spotted a splash of color amidst the forest debris. My heart sank as I recognized the tattered remains of my backpack. "Oh God," I breathed, kneeling to examine it. The sturdy material had been shredded like tissue paper, the contents scattered and destroyed. It was a stark reminder of what could have happened to me. Frank placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. "You're lucky to be alive, kid." As I sifted through the remains of my belongings, a glint of metal caught my eye. With trembling hands, I pulled out my camera, miraculously intact despite the destruction around it. "The memory card," I said, hope rising in my chest. "I was taking pictures before the attack. If we could just—" A low, rumbling growl cut through the air, freezing us both in place. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, vibrating through the ground beneath our feet. "Frank," I whispered, my voice tight with fear. "Please tell me that was your stomach." But Frank's face had gone pale, his eyes wide as he scanned the tree line. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his rifle. "We need to go," he said, his voice barely audible. Now, we backed away from the clearing, every step measured and careful. The growl came again, closer this time, accompanied by the sound of something large moving through the underbrush. My heart pounded in my chest, memories of yellow eyes and gleaming fangs flooding my mind. This couldn't be happening. Not again. "Run!" Frank hissed suddenly. "Run!" We took off through the forest, crashing through branches and leaping over fallen logs. The sound of pursuit was close behind, a symphony of snarls and snapping twigs that spurred us to greater speed. My injured leg screamed in protest, but terror gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. Frank was just ahead of me, his rifle at the ready as he cleared a path through the undergrowth. "The truck," he gasped between breaths. "If we can just make it to the truck." A roar split the air, so close it made my ears ring. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. A massive shape was bounding through the trees, moving with impossible speed and grace for something so large. "Frank!" I yelled in warning, but it was too late. The creature burst from the tree line, cutting off our path to the vehicle. In the fading afternoon light, it seemed even more terrifying than I remembered. Matted fur, rippling muscles, and those horrible yellow eyes fixed on us with predatory intent. Frank raised his rifle, but the beast was faster. With a swipe of its massive paw, it sent the weapon flying into the underbrush. We stood there, frozen in terror as the creature advanced. Its jaws parted in what almost looked like a grin, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. This was it, I thought. After everything, this was how it would end. But as the beast tensed to spring, a new sound cut through the forest, the distant rumble of an engine. The creature's head snapped toward the noise, its ears twitching. For a moment, nobody moved. Then, with a final bone-chilling howl, the beast turned and disappeared into the deepening shadows of the forest. Frank and I stood there gasping for breath, unable to believe our luck. The sound of the engine grew louder, and soon headlights cut through the gloom. As a battered pickup truck pulled into view, I felt a confusing mix of relief and frustration. We were saved, yes, but once again the creature had vanished without a trace. No one would believe us. We had no proof, or did we? As Frank waved down the approaching vehicle, I clutched the camera tightly to my chest. Maybe, just maybe, we had the evidence we needed after all. But as the truck drew closer and I saw the familiar face of Sheriff Harding behind the wheel, a new worry took hold. Would he believe what the camera showed? Or had we just walked into even more danger? The forest watched silently as the sheriff's truck came to a stop, holding its secrets close. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing for certain. Our nightmare was far from over. The weak morning light filtered through the dense canopy, casting eerie shadows across the forest floor. Frank and I had been trudging through the wilderness for hours, our nerves frayed to the breaking point. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. I knew we were being hunted. "We should have never come back," I muttered, my voice barely above a whisper. Frank's jaw was set in a grim line. "We had to," he replied tersely. "No one else believes us. If we don't stop this thing, more people will die." I nodded, but doubt gnawed at me. What chance did we really have against that monster? The memory of its savage attack still haunted my dreams. We pressed on, the silence broken only by our labored breathing and the crunch of leaves underfoot. The air felt thick, oppressive. It was as if the very forest was holding its breath, waiting. Suddenly, Frank froze. His hand shot out, gripping my arm painfully. "Did you hear that?" he hissed. I strained my ears but heard nothing beyond the usual forest sounds. Then, a low growl, so deep it seemed to vibrate in my chest. My blood ran cold. "It's here," I whispered. Frank raised his rifle, scanning the tree line. "Stay close," he ordered. We moved slowly, back to back, every sense on high alert. The growling had stopped, but the silence was somehow worse. I could feel eyes on us, predatory and hungry. Without warning, the underbrush to our left exploded outward. A massive shape hurtled towards us, all fur and fangs and raw, terrifying power. The werewolf was even more horrifying in the daylight, its eyes burning with inhuman intelligence and murderous intent. Frank swung his rifle around, but in his haste, the weapon jammed with a sickening click. "Run!" he screamed, shoving me forward. We sprinted through the forest, branches whipping at our faces. The creature's hot, fetid breath was on our heels, spurring us to impossible speeds. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but primal terror kept me moving. "There!" Frank gasped, pointing ahead. A clearing appeared through the trees. For a moment, hope surged within me. Then my stomach dropped as I realized what we were running towards. The tree line abruptly ended, giving way to a sheer cliff face. Far below, I could hear the roar of a river, swollen from the recent rains. We skidded to a halt at the precipice, pebbles skittering over the edge. Slowly, we turned to face our pursuer. The werewolf prowled at the edge of the clearing, its massive form blocking any chance of escape. A low, rumbling growl emanated from its chest as it bared yellowed fangs. There was no trace of humanity left in those blood-red eyes. "Frank," I whispered, my voice shaking. "What do we do?" He was frantically working the bolt on his rifle, trying to clear the jam. I can't." The creature's muscles bunched, preparing to spring. In that moment, time seemed to slow. I saw Frank's eyes widen in realization. I saw the werewolf's claws dig into the earth, and I saw the raging river far below. "Jump!" Frank roared, grabbing my arm. We leapt just as the monster lunged. For a heart-stopping moment, we were suspended in mid-air. The werewolf's triumphant howl echoed across the mountains, chilling me to my very core. Then gravity took hold, and we plummeted towards the churning waters below. The impact drove the air from my lungs. Icy water enveloped me, tumbling me head over heels. I flailed desperately, fighting to reach the surface. My head broke through, and I gasped for air, only to be dragged under again by the current. Panic threatened to overwhelm me as I was tossed about like a rag doll. My chest burned, screaming for oxygen. Just as spots began to dance before my eyes, a strong hand gripped my collar, hauling me upward. We burst from the water. Frank's arm locked around my chest. He kicked powerfully, guiding us towards the riverbank. With the last of our strength, we dragged ourselves onto the muddy shore, coughing and sputtering. For long minutes we lay there, chests heaving. The roar of the river was punctuated by our ragged breathing. Slowly I raised my head. Scanning the cliff we had just leapt from, there was no sign of pursuit. Did we make it? I croaked. Frank pushed himself to his knees, wincing. I think so, for now at least. I sat up, taking stock of our situation. We were battered, soaked to the bone and miles from civilization, but we were alive. What now? I asked. Frank's expression hardened. We get back to town. We warn everyone, and we make damn sure they believe us this time. I nodded, struggling to my feet. My body ached and I could feel fresh bruises forming, but the alternative, staying in these woods, was unthinkable. As we began our long trek back to civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling that our ordeal was far from over. The werewolf was still out there, and I knew with chilling certainty that it wouldn't stop until it had finished what it started. The sun climbed higher in the sky as we stumbled through the wilderness. Every shadow seemed to hide a lurking threat, every sound a potential ambush. The adrenaline that had carried us through our desperate flight was fading, leaving us exhausted and on edge. We need to find help, I said, my voice hoarse. A ranger station, anything. Frank nodded grimly. Agreed. But we have to be careful. If we start raving about werewolves... He didn't need to finish the thought. We'd both seen the looks of disbelief, even ridicule, when we'd tried to explain what happened before. This time had to be different. As we pushed on, the events of the past day replayed in my mind. The terror of being hunted, the heart-stopping moment on the cliff. It all felt surreal, like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. But the ache in my muscles and the chill of my wet clothes were all too real. Frank, I said suddenly, a thought occurring to me. Do you think it can swim? He was silent for a long moment. I don't know, he finally admitted. But I'm not keen on finding out. Let's pick up the pace. We quickened our steps, ignoring our protesting bodies. The forest seemed endless, a green maze with no exit in sight. But we pressed on, driven by the primal need to survive and the desperate hope of warning others. As the day wore on, exhaustion began to take its toll. We stumbled more frequently, our progress slowing. Just as despair started to creep in, we heard a sound that made our hearts leap. The distant rumble of an engine. A road, Frank breathed. Come on. We broke into a stumbling run, following the sound. The trees began to thin, and suddenly we burst out onto a gravel road. In the distance, we could see a battered pickup truck approaching. Frank waved his arms frantically, and I joined in, shouting hoarsely. The truck slowed, then came to a stop beside us. An older man with a weathered face peered out at us suspiciously. You boys all right? He asked, taking in our bedraggled appearance. I opened my mouth to speak, but Frank cut me off. Had an accident, he said quickly. Our canoe capsized upriver. Can you give us a lift to town? The man's expression softened. Hop in the back, he said. I'll take you to the ranger station. They can sort you out from there. As we climbed into the truck bed, relief washed over me. We were safe, for now at least. But I knew our ordeal was far from over. We still had to convince people of the danger lurking in these woods. Still had to find a way to stop that monster before it killed again. The truck rumbled to life, carrying us away from the forest. I cast one last glance back at the seemingly peaceful trees. Somewhere in those depths, a nightmare waited, and I had a sinking feeling that this was only the beginning of our battle against an evil beyond imagining. The steering wheel felt slick beneath my sweaty palms as I navigated the twisting mountain road. My old Subaru groaned with each sharp turn, the trunk loaded with camping gear clattering ominously. The deeper I drove into the Adirondack wilderness, the more isolated I felt. Cell service had disappeared hours ago, leaving me truly alone with my thoughts. I'd planned this solo camping trip as a way to clear my head after a messy breakup, but now, as the dense forest pressed in on both sides of the narrow road, I was beginning to question my decision. The GPS had lost signal long ago, leaving me to rely on the few faded signposts and my own questionable sense of direction. Just a little further, I muttered to myself, squinting at the rapidly darkening sky. The sun was setting faster than I'd anticipated, casting long shadows across the road. I needed to find a suitable campsite soon, or I'd be setting up in the dark. Finally, after what felt like hours of driving, I spotted a small dirt road branching off to the right. A weathered wooden sign declared it Bear Creek Trail. It wasn't exactly inviting, but beggars couldn't be choosers. I carefully turned onto the rough path, wincing as branches scraped against the side of my car. About a half-mile in, the road opened up into a small clearing. It wasn't an official campsite, but it would do. I parked the car and stepped out, stretching my cramped muscles. The silence was immediate and absolute, broken only by the occasional distant bird call. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. I set to work unpacking my gear, trying to ignore the growing unease in the pit of my stomach. The shadows seemed to deepen with each passing minute, and I fumbled with the tent poles as I rushed to get set up before nightfall. Come on, I hissed, finally managing to secure the last stake. I'd chosen a small clearing about 50 feet from where I'd parked, surrounded by towering pines. It seemed like a good spot, sheltered from the wind, but now the trees loomed ominously, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. With the tent erected, I gathered some fallen branches and started a small campfire. The warm glow provided some comfort, pushing back the encroaching darkness. I heated up a can of soup over the flames, more out of necessity than hunger. My appetite had disappeared, replaced by a gnawing anxiety I couldn't quite explain. As I ate, I tried to shake off my nerves. Get it together, I told myself firmly. You've been camping before. There's nothing out here that can hurt you. A sudden snap of a twig in the darkness beyond my campfire made me jump, nearly spilling my soup. I whirled around, peering into the gloom, but saw nothing. My heart raced as I strained my ears, listening for any further sound. Probably just a squirrel, I said aloud, trying to convince myself, but the woods remained eerily still, as if holding its breath. I quickly finished my meal and cleaned up, not wanting to attract any wildlife, or worse, bears, to my campsite. The fire had burned low, and I debated adding more wood. Part of me craved the light and warmth, but another part whispered that it was safer to remain inconspicuous in the dark. Finally, exhaustion won out over fear. I doused the fire and retreated to my tent, zipping myself securely into my sleeping bag. The nylon walls suddenly seemed pitifully thin, offering little protection from whatever might be lurking in the forest. I closed my eyes, willing sleep to come, but every little sound jolted me awake. The rustle of leaves in the breeze, the crack of a branch somewhere in the distance. My own breathing, unnaturally loud in the confined space of the tent. Just as I was starting to drift off, a sound cut through the night that made my blood run cold. A howl, long and mournful, echoed through the trees. But this was no ordinary wolf's cry. It was deeper, more guttural, with an almost human quality that sent shivers down my spine. I sat bolt upright, my sleeping bag tangled around my legs. "What the hell was that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The howl came again, closer this time. It was a sound of hunger, of rage, of something ancient and primal. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was hearing. A coyote? A feral dog? But deep down I knew it was something else entirely. Something huge had been here, mere feet from where I'd slept. A twig snapped in the woods behind me and I whirled around, my heart pounding. The trees swayed gently in the morning breeze, but I could swear I saw a flash of movement, a glimpse of matted fur disappearing into the shadows. In that moment, I knew with certainty that I wasn't alone in these woods. Something was out there, something that defied explanation. And as the sun rose higher in the sky, I couldn't shake the feeling that when night fell again it would return. I needed to get out of here to warn someone. The day had passed in a haze of anxiety and second-guessing. Every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves had me jumping, convinced that the creature I'd glimpsed that morning was about to emerge from the shadows. But as the sun began to set, painting the sky in ominous shades of red and purple, I realized I had nowhere else to go. My car was low on gas, and I didn't trust myself to navigate the treacherous mountain roads in the dark. So here I was, once again zipped into my flimsy tent, trying to convince myself that last night's terrors were just a product of an overactive imagination. The sleeping bag felt suffocating, but I didn't dare leave it. It was the only barrier, however ineffective, between me and whatever might be lurking in the darkness. I must have dozed off eventually, exhaustion overwhelming fear. But my rest was far from peaceful. Nightmares plagued me. Visions of yellow eyes and razor-sharp teeth, of being chased through an endless dark forest. A sound jolted me awake, a real sound, not part of my dreams. For a moment, I lay perfectly still, ears straining. There it was again, a low growl, so deep I felt it in my chest more than heard it. It was close. Too close. Before I could react, before I could even draw breath to scream, the world exploded into chaos. The sickening sound of ripping fabric filled the air as massive claws tore through the tent like it was tissue paper. Moonlight poured in through the gashes, and with it came a stench that made my stomach heave. Wet fur, rotting meat, and something unmistakably feral. I bolted upright, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. And there, framed in the ruins of my tent, was a nightmare made flesh. The creature was enormous, far larger than any wolf or bear I'd ever seen. It stood on two legs, its hunched form easily 7 or 8 feet tall. Matted fur covered its muscular body, and wicked claws extended from massive paws. But it was the face that struck true terror into my soul. It was a twisted amalgamation of wolf and human, with a long snout filled with gleaming fangs and eyes. Dear God, those eyes. They glowed an unearthly yellow in the moonlight, filled with an intelligence that was terrifyingly human, and a hunger that was anything but. For a heartbeat that felt like an eternity, those eyes locked with mine. I saw myself reflected in them, saw my own fear, my own insignificance in the face of this primal force of nature. And I saw my own death, mere seconds away if I didn't move. The creature lunged forward with a roar that shook me to my very core. Adrenaline surged through my body and I scrambled backward, fighting to free myself from the confines of my sleeping bag. Claws raked the ground where I had been lying just moments before, shredding the bag and barely missing my legs. "No, no, no," I screamed, my voice high and strangled with terror. I kicked frantically, finally freeing myself from the sleeping bag. The werewolf, for what else could I call this monster, snapped its massive jaws, teeth gleaming inches from my face. I could feel its hot, fetid breath on my skin, smell the blood of previous kills. Pure instinct took over. I rolled to the side, scrambling on all fours out of the ruined tent. My bare feet slipped on the dew-damp grass as I struggled to stand. Behind me, I heard the creature snarling, heard the sound of it tearing through what remained of my meager shelter. I ran. I ran like I had never run before, with no thought of direction or destination. My only goal was to put distance between myself and the monster. The forest was a dark blur around me, branches whipping at my face and arms, roots threatening to trip me with every step. But I didn't slow down. I couldn't. The sounds of pursuit drove me forward, heavy footfalls, snapping branches, and that terrible primal growling. "Help!" I screamed, though I knew it was futile. There was no one out here to help me, no one to hear my cries. "Somebody, please." I don't know how long I ran. It could have been minutes or hours. Time lost all meaning in the face of sheer terror. My lungs burned, my legs trembled with exhaustion, but still I pushed on. The beast's breath seemed to be constantly on my neck, urging me forward whenever my pace began to flag. Suddenly the trees thinned, and I burst out of the forest onto a rocky shore. The river. In my panic, I had unknowingly run in the right direction. Without hesitation, I plunged into the icy water. It was shockingly cold, stealing the breath from my lungs, but I welcomed it. Water might throw the creature off my scent, might give me a chance. As I struggled against the current, I risked a glance back. And there, silhouetted against the full moon on the riverbank, stood the werewolf. Its massive form was unmistakable, head tilted back in a howl of frustration. The sound carried clearly over the rush of the water, making my blood run colder than the river itself. For a moment our eyes met once more. There was rage there, yes, but also disappointment? As if I was prey that had narrowly escaped its grasp. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the creature turned and loped back into the shadows of the forest, its form seeming to melt into the darkness. I didn't stop swimming. I couldn't. Even though I could no longer see the werewolf, I knew it was still out there. I let the current carry me downstream, too exhausted to do more than keep my head above water. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion and terror. What I had seen was impossible, and yet I knew with bone-deep certainty that it was real. As the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, I finally dragged myself onto a rocky bank, shivering uncontrollably. I was miles from my campsite, soaked to the bone, and utterly lost. But I was alive. I huddled on the shore, watching the sun rise and trying to make sense of what had happened. One thing was clear. I needed help. I needed to warn someone about the monster in these woods. But as the full reality of the night's events settled over me, a new fear began to take hold. The icy water of the river shocked my system as I plunged in, gasping for air. My lungs burned, screaming for oxygen, but I forced myself to keep swimming. The current was strong, tugging at my limbs, threatening to pull me under. But the memory of those glowing yellow eyes, that monstrous form silhouetted against the moon, drove me forward. "Keep going," I wheezed to myself, my teeth chattering violently. "It can't follow you in the water." I don't know how long I let the river carry me. Time seemed to lose all meaning as I focused solely on keeping my head above water. The forest rushed by on either side, a dark blur of shadows and rustling leaves. Every sound made me flinch, certain that at any moment that hulking form would burst from the tree line. A low-hanging branch scraped across my face as I was swept past, adding to the myriad of cuts and bruises I could feel forming on my body. The sting of it brought me back to my senses somewhat. I couldn't stay in the water forever. I needed to find help, to warn someone about the creature in these woods. With the last reserves of my strength, I angled myself toward the shore. The current fought me, but finally my feet touched the rocky bottom. I stumbled, half swimming, half wading, until I collapsed on a small, pebbly beach. For several long moments I just lay there, shivering uncontrollably, my chest heaving as I gulped in air. The sound of the river rushing by seemed deafening in the pre-dawn quiet. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of pursuit, any hint that the werewolf had somehow followed me. A twig snapped in the forest behind me. I bolted upright, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. My eyes darted wildly, searching the shadows between the trees. Was that movement I saw, or just branches swaying in the breeze? "Hello?" I called out, my voice hoarse and trembling. "Is anyone there?" Only the whisper of the wind through the leaves answered me. Slowly, painfully, I pushed myself to my feet. Every muscle in my body screamed in protest. Now that the immediate danger had passed, I became acutely aware of just how battered I was. The sky was beginning to lighten, the inky blackness giving way to a pale, watery gray. As visibility improved, I took stock of my situation. My clothes were torn and sodden, clinging uncomfortably to my skin. Angry red scratches crisscrossed my arms and legs, some still oozing blood. Bruises were already forming, dark splotches against my pale, cold-reddened skin. Jesus, I muttered, gingerly touching a particularly nasty gash on my forearm. Had that come from a branch? Or from the creature's claws? The memory of those razor-sharp talons slicing through my tent made me shudder. I needed to move. Standing here on the riverbank, I was too exposed. But which way should I go? I had no idea how far the river had carried me or in which direction. For all I knew, I could be walking right back into the werewolf's territory. The thought made my breath catch in my throat. What if it was still out there, hunting me? What if it was watching me right now, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? A rustling in the bushes nearby sent me stumbling backward, nearly falling back into the river. A rabbit hopped out, freezing when it saw me before darting away into the underbrush. Get a grip, I told myself sternly, though my voice shook. You can't stand here forever. With no better option, I decided to follow the river downstream. Civilization had to be somewhere in that direction, right? And at least the sound of the water would mask any noise I made as I moved. As I walked, the sky continued to lighten. The rising sun brought little warmth, but it did help to chase away some of the shadows that had seemed so menacing in the dark. Birds began to chirp, greeting the new day with their songs. It all seemed so normal, so peaceful. If it weren't for my battered state and the lingering terror in my gut, I might have thought the events of the night had been nothing more than a nightmare. But the pain was real. The cuts and bruises were real. And the memory of those eyes, that howl, that was all too real. I don't know how long I walked. My bare feet were numb from the cold, stumbling over rocks and roots. Every step was an effort of will. More than once I found myself swaying on my feet, exhaustion threatening to overwhelm me. Just when I thought I couldn't go on any further, the trees began to thin. Ahead, I could make out what looked like a cleared path. Oh, thank God, I breathed, nearly weeping with relief. A hiking trail. It had to be. And where there were hiking trails, there would be people. Help. I stumbled onto the path, my legs finally giving out. I collapsed to my knees, the gravel of the trail digging into my skin. But I didn't care. I was found. I was safe. As if on cue, I heard voices in the distance, hikers coming up the trail. Hey, I tried to shout, but it came out as little more than a croak. I cleared my throat and tried again. Hey, over here. I need help. The voices grew closer. I could make out two of them now, a man and a woman, their conversation cutting off abruptly at my call. Hello? The man's voice called out. Is someone there? Yes, I cried, waving my arms. Please, I need help. They came around a bend in the trail and stopped short at the sight of me. I can only imagine how I must have looked, soaked, bleeding, wild-eyed with fear and exhaustion. Oh my God, the woman gasped, rushing forward. Are you okay? What happened? I opened my mouth, ready to pour out my story. But as I looked at their concerned faces, I hesitated. How could I explain what had happened? Who would believe me? I was attacked, I managed finally. In the woods. There's something out there. Something dangerous. The couple exchanged a look I couldn't quite interpret. The man pulled out a cell phone, the sight of it almost making me weep with joy. Don't worry, he said, his voice soothing. We're going to call for help. You're safe now. As he dialed, I closed my eyes, relief washing over me. I was safe. I had escaped. But even as the thought formed, a chill ran down my spine. The fluorescent lights of the ranger station buzzed overhead, harsh and unforgiving. I sat wrapped in a scratchy emergency blanket, my damp clothes clinging uncomfortably to my skin. The adrenaline that had kept me going was fading, leaving me shaky and disoriented. Ranger Mike Stevens leaned against his desk, arms folded across his chest. His expression was a mixture of concern and skepticism as I recounted my harrowing experience. "So, let me get this straight," he said, rubbing his temple. "You're saying a werewolf attacked you?" I nodded emphatically. "I know how it sounds, but I swear it's true. It was huge, at least 7 feet tall, with yellow eyes and claws that tore through my tent like it was paper." The ranger's frown deepened. "Mr. Johnson, we take all reports of animal attacks seriously, but a werewolf? Are you sure it wasn't just a bear? We've had some issues with them getting into campsites lately." "It wasn't a bear," I insisted, my voice rising. "I know what I saw. It stood on 2 legs. It had a face that was like a mix between a wolf and a man. Please, you have to believe me. There's something dangerous out there." Ranger Stevens sighed, sharing a look with his colleague by the door. "All right, why don't we call the sheriff? He'll want to take an official statement." An hour later, Sheriff Dave Hawkins arrived. He was a burly man with a no-nonsense attitude, and I could tell from the moment he walked in that he didn't believe a word of my story. "Mr. Johnson," he said, after I'd repeated my account, "I understand you've been through a traumatic experience, but let's think about this logically. Werewolves aren't real. Is it possible you dozed off and had a very vivid nightmare?" I clenched my fists, frustration boiling over. "Does this look like a nightmare to you?" I thrust out my arms, showing the cuts and bruises that covered them. "I didn't do this to myself." The sheriff held up his hands placatingly. Now, I'm not suggesting you did. But you said yourself you ran through the woods in the dark. It's easy to get banged up that way. And the mind can play tricks on us when we're scared. "I'm not crazy," I insisted, tears of anger and fear welling up in my eyes. "Why won't anyone believe me?" "We believe you experienced something frightening," Ranger Stevens interjected. "But let's focus on the facts. You were alone in the woods, your campsite was destroyed, and you got injured. We'll investigate, see if we can find any signs of the animal that did this. In the meantime, let's get you checked out at the clinic." I slumped in defeat, realizing it was useless to argue further. They had already made up their minds. At the small local clinic, a tired-looking doctor named Alan Mercer examined my injuries. His eyes narrowed as he cleaned a particularly deep gash on my arm. "This is an unusual wound," he muttered. "Almost looks like... But no, that's not possible." "Like what?" I asked, a flicker of hope igniting. "Like a claw mark?" Dr. Mercer's expression shuddered. No. Probably just caught it on a sharp branch or rock. You're lucky, nothing seems to need stitches. I'll give you some antibiotic ointment and bandage you up." As he worked, I tried one more time. "Doctor, I know what caused these injuries. There's a creature out there, something dangerous. You have to warn people." The doctor paused, eyeing me warily. "Mr. Johnson, have you experienced any head trauma recently? Any dizziness or confusion?" My heart sank. Even the doctor thought I was crazy or concussed. "No," I said quietly. "Never mind." After I was patched up, I borrowed the clinic's phone to call my family. Surely they would believe me, right? But as I poured out my story to my sister, I could hear the doubt in her voice. "Alex, honey," she said gently, "are you sure you're okay? Maybe you should come home for a while. Rest, you know?" "I'm not making this up, Sarah," I nearly shouted, drawing concerned looks from the clinic staff. "Why doesn't anyone believe me?" "We're just worried about you," she soothed. "Look, why don't you get some sleep, and we'll talk more in the morning. Everything will seem clearer then." I hung up, feeling more alone than ever. The sheriff had advised me to stay in town overnight, suggesting a small motel down the street. As I checked in, the desk clerk eyed my bandages and disheveled appearance suspiciously. "Rough night, huh?" he asked, handing me a key. I just nodded, too exhausted to even try explaining anymore. The motel room was small and shabby, but I barely noticed. I sank onto the bed, my mind whirling. I knew what I had seen. The werewolf was real. Its yellow eyes and savage snarl burned into my memory. But no one believed me. They all thought I was crazy or lying or both. As the sun began to set outside my window, a new fear gripped me. The creature was still out there. What if it came looking for me? What if it attacked someone else? And how could I warn anyone when no one would listen? I curled up on the bed, every sound from outside making me flinch. Sleep seemed impossible, but exhaustion was pulling at me. As my eyes drifted shut, one thought echoed in my mind. I was utterly alone with the knowledge of the monster in the woods. The morning sun filtered through the grimy motel window, waking me from a fitful sleep plagued by nightmares of glowing yellow eyes and razor-sharp claws. For a moment I lay there, hoping it had all been just a terrible dream. But the ache in my muscles and the bandages covering my arms were stark reminders of the reality I faced. I knew what I had to do. No one believed me. Not the rangers, not the sheriff, not even my own family. If I was going to prove what happened, I needed evidence. And there was only one place to get it. My hands trembled as I gripped the steering wheel of my rental car. The agency had given me odd looks when I'd shown up, battered and wild-eyed, but money talks. Now, as I navigated the winding mountain roads back to my campsite, every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn around. "You can do this," I muttered to myself, knuckles white on the wheel. "You have to do this. It's the only way." The parking area where I'd left my car seemed eerily unchanged. It was as if the horrors of 2 nights ago had never happened. I stepped out of the rental, my legs feeling like jelly beneath me. The forest loomed ahead, dark and forbidding even in the morning light. Each step into the woods filled me with dread. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig made me flinch. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, convinced that at any moment that monstrous form would come bursting through the underbrush. "It's daylight," I reminded myself, though my voice sounded small and unconvincing even to my own ears. "Werewolves are nocturnal, right? It won't be out now." But even as I said it, I knew it was a foolish assumption. The creature I'd encountered defied all logic and reason. Who was to say it followed any rules? As I approached the clearing where I'd set up camp, my breath caught in my throat. There, exactly as I'd left it, were the shredded remains of my tent. Seeing it in the harsh light of day somehow made it even more terrifying. The nylon was in tatters, great rents torn through it as if it were tissue paper. "Oh God," I whispered, my legs threatening to give out beneath me. I forced myself to approach to examine the destruction up close. My sleeping bag lay in ribbons, stuffing scattered across the forest floor. My backpack had been torn open, its contents strewn about haphazardly. And there, in a patch of soft mud near where the tent had stood, was the evidence I'd been praying for. A massive paw print, easily twice the size of my hand, with clear claw marks extending from the toes. My heart raced as I fumbled for my phone, hands shaking so badly I could barely operate the camera. I snapped picture after picture, determined to document everything before it could disappear. "This is it," I said aloud, a hysterical laugh bubbling up in my throat. "This is the proof. They'll have to believe me now." But even as the words left my mouth, I knew it wasn't enough. Paw prints, no matter how large, could be explained away. A bear, they'd say, or a hoax. I needed more. I began to search the area frantically, looking for any other sign of the creature. A tuft of fur caught on a branch, claw marks on a tree, anything that would corroborate my story. So focused was I on my search that I almost missed it at first. A low, rumbling growl, so deep I felt it in my chest more than heard it. I froze, blood turning to ice in my veins. Slowly, I turned toward the sound. The underbrush at the edge of the clearing rustled ominously, and there, barely visible in the shadows, I caught a glimpse of yellow eyes watching me. Time seemed to stand still. I stared into those eyes, seeing the same primal hunger that had haunted my nightmares. The creature, the werewolf, was still here, still hunting. "No," I breathed, my body tensing to run. No, no, no. The growl grew louder. I saw a flash of movement, of matted fur and gleaming claws. Terror exploded through me like a lightning bolt. I turned and ran, crashing through the forest with no thought but escape. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me, but I didn't slow down. I couldn't. Behind me I heard the sound of pursuit, heavy footfalls, snapping branches, that bone-chilling growl growing ever closer. I burst out of the tree line into the parking area, my lungs burning, legs trembling with exertion and fear. The rental car stood there, a beacon of safety. If I could just reach it. My fumbling hands found the keys. I wrenched the door open and threw myself inside, slamming it shut behind me. The engine roared to life and I stomped on the accelerator, tires squealing as I peeled out of the lot. In the rearview mirror, I caught one last glimpse of the forest's edge. For a moment, I thought I saw a massive, shadowy form watching me go. But then it was gone, melting back into the trees as if it had never been there at all. I drove recklessly, putting as much distance between myself and that cursed campsite as possible. My mind raced. I had the photos. I had seen the creature again. But would it be enough? Would anyone believe me? As the mountain roads gave way to more civilized areas, a grim determination settled over me. I might not have concrete proof, but I knew the truth. That thing was out there, and it was only a matter of time before it struck again. I may not be able to convince the authorities, but I had to try. Somehow, some way, I had to warn people about the monster lurking in those woods, even if it meant risking everything, my reputation, my sanity, my very life. The dim light of my laptop screen cast an eerie glow across the motel room as I hunched over it, my eyes burning from hours of intense searching. The cheap coffee from the vending machine had long since gone cold, but I barely noticed as I clicked through page after page of local news reports. There has to be something, I muttered, scrolling frantically. I can't be the only one who's seen it. My fingers flew across the keyboard, trying every combination of search terms I could think of. Animal attack, strange creature sighting, unexplained disappearance. Most of the results were dead ends. Bear encounters, mountain lion warnings, the usual stuff you'd expect in a rural area. But then, buried in the archives of the local newspaper, I found something that made my blood run cold. Hiker missing in Adirondack wilderness, the headline read. I leaned in closer, my heart pounding. IQ, the article, dated just 3 months ago, described how an experienced backpacker had vanished without a trace during a solo trip. Search and rescue teams had found his campsite in disarray, with his tent shredded and belongings scattered. Just like mine, I whispered, a chill running down my spine. I dug deeper, and a pattern began to emerge. Over the past year, there had been 3 other disappearances in the same general area. All solo hikers, all with campsites found in similar states of destruction. But it wasn't just people. As I expanded my search, I uncovered reports of livestock mutilations on farms near the edge of the forest. Sheep and cattle found torn apart, with wounds that baffled local veterinarians. One farmer's quote jumped out at me. I've dealt with coyotes and bears before, but I've never seen anything like this. It's like something out of a horror movie. I sat back, running a shaky hand through my hair. This was it. Proof that something was out there. Something that had been terrorizing the area for months. But why hadn't anyone connected the dots? A new search led me to an article so old it had been scanned from microfiche. Local tribe warns of skinwalker in mountains, the faded headline proclaimed. I read on, my skin crawling as I absorbed the details of an ancient Native American legend about a shape-shifting creature that preyed on the unwary. The skinwalker is said to take the form of a massive wolf, the article stated, with the cunning of a man and the savagery of a beast. It hunts alone, striking from the shadows and vanishing without a trace. The description was so eerily close to what I had encountered that I slammed the laptop shut, suddenly unable to look at it anymore. I paced the small motel room, my mind racing. Can't be, I said aloud, trying to convince myself. Werewolves, skinwalkers, they're just stories, myths. But the image of those glowing yellow eyes, the memory of hot breath on my neck as I ran for my life, those were all too real. A sudden thump outside my door made me jump, my heart leaping into my throat. I froze, straining to listen. Was that heavy breathing I heard or just the wind? Cautiously, I crept to the window and peeked through the curtains. The parking lot was empty, lit only by the flickering neon of the motel sign. Nothing moved in the shadows. Get a grip, I muttered. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being hunted. I turned back to my laptop, determined to find some rational explanation for everything I discovered. But as the hours ticked by and my eyes grew heavy, the pieces refused to fit together in any way that made sense. The missing hikers, the mutilated animals, the ancient legends, and at the center of it all, the creature I had seen with my own eyes. A creature that, by all rights, shouldn't exist. I must have dozed off at some point because I jerked awake to the sound of my own ragged breathing. The room was dark, my laptop having gone to sleep. For a moment I was disoriented, unsure of where I was or what had woken me. Then I heard it, a low, rumbling growl from somewhere outside. I scrambled off the bed, nearly falling in my haste to get to the window. My hands shook as I parted the curtains just enough to peer out. The parking lot was still empty, but at the edge of the forest across the street I caught a glimpse of movement. Something large slipping between the trees, there and gone so quickly I might have imagined it. But I knew I hadn't. Sleep was impossible after that. I sat on the edge of the bed, every muscle tense, jumping at every creak of the old motel's settling foundations. My mind raced, trying to piece together everything I had learned. The werewolf, or skinwalker, or whatever it was, had been here for months, maybe years. It had attacked others before me, and now, somehow, it had followed me here. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the curtains, I came to a grim realization. I couldn't let this go. I couldn't just walk away and pretend none of this had happened, because if I did, more people would disappear. More families would be left wondering what had happened to their loved ones. I had to do something. I had to make someone believe me no matter what it took. With shaking hands, I reached for my phone. It was time to take this to the next level. Time to force someone to listen. The fluorescent lights of the ranger station buzzed overhead, harsh and unforgiving. I sat across from Ranger Mike Stevens, my hands shaking as I spread out the printouts of my evidence on his cluttered desk. "Mr. Johnson," Stevens sighed, rubbing his temples, "we've been over this. I understand you had a frightening experience, but—" "Just look," I interrupted, pushing forward a blurry photo of the paw print. "This is twice the size of any bear print, and look at the claw marks on this tree. It's not natural." Stevens picked up the photo, squinting at it. This could easily be a large black bear. And these claw marks? Probably just a cat sharpening its claws. It happens all the time. "But what about the missing hikers?" I pressed, my voice rising. "The mutilated livestock? It all fits." The ranger's expression hardened. "Mr. Johnson, those are ongoing investigations. I can't discuss them with you, but I can assure you there's nothing supernatural going on here." "You're not listening." I slammed my hand on the desk, frustration boiling over. "There's a pattern. Something is out there, and it's killing people." Stevens stood up, his patience clearly at an end. "That's enough. I've humored you because I know you've been through something traumatic. But this ends now. Go home, Mr. Johnson, get some rest. See a therapist if you need to. But stop chasing monsters." I stumbled out of the station, feeling dazed and defeated. But I couldn't give up. Someone had to believe me. My next stop was the local newspaper office. Surely a reporter would see the story here, would be willing to investigate. "Hello," I called out, entering the small, cluttered office. "Is anyone here?" A woman in her mid-40s emerged from behind a stack of papers. "Can I help you?" "Are you a reporter?" I asked desperately. When she nodded, I launched into my story. words tumbling out in a frantic rush. As I spoke, the woman's expression shifted from polite interest to barely concealed amusement. By the time I finished, she was openly smirking. "Let me get this straight," she said, laughter in her voice. "You want me to run a story about a werewolf terrorizing the Adirondacks, based on your encounter and some vague connections to missing persons cases?" "It's not funny," I snapped. "People are in danger." She held up her hand, still chuckling. "Look, buddy, I'm sure you believe what you're saying, but we're a serious newspaper. We deal in facts, not fairy tales." "But, thanks for stopping by," she said, already turning away. "If you see Bigfoot, be sure to let us know." The door closed behind me, leaving me standing on the sidewalk, feeling more alone than ever. That night, in my dingy motel room, I called my sister Sarah. I needed to hear a friendly voice, someone who would understand. "Alex?" Sarah's concerned tone came through the phone. "Are you okay? We've been so worried." "I'm fine," I lied, my voice cracking. I need you to believe me, Sarah, about what happened." There was a long pause. "Oh, honey," she said softly. "I know you think you saw something, but maybe it wasn't exactly what you thought it was. Stress can do funny things to the mind." "Not you too," I whispered, tears welling up. "I'm not crazy, Sarah. I know what I saw." "I'm not saying you're crazy," she backpedaled. "But Alex, werewolves aren't real. You have to know that deep down." I ended the call shortly after, feeling even more isolated than before. In desperation, I turned to the internet, searching for anyone who might take me seriously. I found a forum dedicated to cryptozoology and poured out my story, hoping someone there would understand. The responses came quickly. "Pics or it didn't happen, bro. Sounds more like a skinwalker than a werewolf. Get your lore straight. Classic case of pareidolia and an overactive imagination." One user with the handle Werewolf Expert 92 was particularly dismissive. "Look, I've been studying werewolf lore for years, and your story doesn't match up with any known accounts. Real werewolves don't hunt alone, they run in packs. And they certainly don't leave survivors. Nice try, but you need to do more research before making up stories." I slammed my laptop shut, a scream of frustration building in my throat. Why wouldn't anyone listen? Why couldn't they see the truth that was right in front of them? The tears came then, hot and bitter. I curled up on the lumpy motel bed, my body racked with sobs. I was alone. Utterly, completely alone with the knowledge of what was out there. As night fell, I found myself staring out the window at the distant line of trees. Somewhere out there, the creature was waiting, hunting, and no one believed me. In that moment, I realized a terrible truth. If anything was going to be done about the monster in the woods, I would have to do it myself, no matter the cost. The motel room felt suffocating, the walls closing in on me with each passing minute. I paced back and forth, my mind a chaotic whirlwind of fear, doubt, and grim determination. The decision before me was impossible, yet I knew I had to make it. My duffel bag lay open on the bed, half packed. I stared at it, my hands shaking as I reached for another shirt. Every instinct screamed at me to finish packing, to get in my car and drive as far away from these cursed mountains as possible, to forget everything I'd seen and try to piece my sanity back together. But then I thought of the missing hikers, of the families left wondering what had happened to their loved ones. I thought of the next unsuspecting camper who might fall prey to the monster lurking in the woods. "I can't just leave," I muttered to myself, running a hand through my disheveled hair. "If I don't do something, who will?" The weight of responsibility settled heavily on my shoulders. I knew what I had to do, even as every fiber of my being rebelled against it. With trembling hands, I reached for my phone and pulled up the website of the local outdoor supply store. My finger hovered over the Add to Cart button for a long moment before I finally pressed it, sealing my fate. An hour later, I stood in the aisles of Mountain Man Mike's Outfitters, surrounded by camping gear that now seemed more like instruments of torture. Each item I picked up, a new tent, a high-powered flashlight, extra batteries, felt like another nail in my coffin. The clerk, a cheerful young man with a bushy beard, chatted amiably as he rang up my purchases. "Heading out for a solo trip?" he asked, eyeing the pile of gear. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "Well, be careful out there," he said, his tone growing serious. "We've had some strange animal activity lately. Make sure you store your food properly and stay alert." If only he knew. As I loaded the supplies into my car, a wave of nausea washed over me. What was I doing? Was I really going back out there, deliberately putting myself in the path of that thing? But I knew the answer. I had to. I was the only one who knew the truth, the only one who could expose it. The drive back to the mountains was a blur. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, my eyes constantly darting to the rearview mirror as if expecting to see a monstrous shape loping after me. Every mile marker felt like a countdown to my doom. "You can do this," I whispered to myself, though my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. "You have to do this." As I turned onto the familiar forest road, my heart began to race. Memories of that terrifying night flooded back. The sound of ripping canvas, the hot breath on my neck, those glowing yellow eyes. I shook my head violently, trying to dispel the images. I couldn't afford to panic now. I chose a clearing about a mile from my original campsite. Close enough to where I'd seen the creature, but hopefully far enough that it wouldn't immediately find me. As I set up my new tent with shaking hands, every snapping twig and rustling leaf made me flinch. The sun began to sink behind the trees, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for me like grasping claws. I forced myself to go through the motions of setting up camp, all the while feeling like I was preparing my own tomb. As darkness fell, I huddled in my tent, clutching my camera and flashlight like talismans. The night sounds of the forest, once peaceful, now seemed ominous and threatening. Every hoot of an owl, every scurrying of a small animal in the underbrush sent my heart racing. "Come on," I muttered, my eyes straining to penetrate the darkness outside the thin nylon walls. "Where are you?" Hours crawled by. My muscles ached from the tension, but I didn't dare relax. It was out there. I knew it was. It had to be. A twig snapped nearby, louder than the others. I froze, hardly daring to breathe. Was this it? Slowly, carefully, I unzipped the tent flap just enough to peer out. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating trees and bushes. Nothing moved. But then, just at the edge of the light, I caught a glimpse of something. A flash of yellow eyes, there and gone so quickly I might have imagined it. My heart pounded so hard I was sure it would burst from my chest. With trembling hands, I raised the camera, my finger poised over the shutter button. "Please," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I was praying for the creature to appear or to stay away. "Please." A low, rumbling growl cut through the night, so close it seemed to vibrate the very air around me. I whirled toward the sound, the camera forgotten in my hand. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood a massive shape. Larger than any wolf, larger than any bear. Its yellow eyes gleamed with an otherworldly intelligence as it stared directly at me. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. I stared into those eyes, seeing the same primal hunger that had haunted my nightmares. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that I had made a terrible mistake. The werewolf, for what else could it be, took a step forward, its massive paws leaving imprints in the soft earth. Another step, and another. It was coming for me. The night was deathly quiet. Too quiet. The usual symphony of crickets and nightbirds had fallen silent, as if the entire forest was holding its breath in anticipation of something terrible. I crouched at the edge of my campsite, camera clutched in sweaty hands, every muscle tense and ready to spring. Hours had passed since I'd glimpsed those yellow eyes, but I knew the creature was still out there. waiting, watching. "Come on," I whispered, my voice barely audible even to my own ears. "Show yourself." As if in answer to my challenge, a blood-curdling howl shattered the night's silence. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not quite wolf, not quite human, but a horrifying blend of both. The sound sent ice through my veins, freezing me in place. The howl faded, leaving behind an oppressive silence. For a moment I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then, from somewhere behind me, came the unmistakable snap of a twig. I whirled around, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The darkness between the trees seemed to shift and move, shadows taking on monstrous shapes. "It's just your imagination," I tried to tell myself, but the words rang hollow even in my own mind. Another snap, closer this time. My hands shook violently as I raised the camera, trying desperately to keep it steady. I peered through the viewfinder, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. There, a flash of movement caught my eye. I swung the camera towards it, my finger tensing on the shutter button. For a split second, I saw it. Matted fur, gleaming teeth, those terrible yellow eyes glowing with an otherworldly hunger. I pressed the button, and the world exploded into blinding white as the flash went off. I stumbled backward, momentarily blinded, blinking furiously to clear the spots from my vision. A low, rumbling growl cut through the ringing in my ears. As my vision cleared, I saw it properly for the first time. The werewolf stood at the edge of the clearing, its massive form silhouetted against the darkness of the forest. It was even larger than I remembered, easily 7 feet tall when standing on its hind legs. Muscles rippled beneath its shaggy coat, and its claws, God, those claws, looked like they could tear through steel. But it was the face that truly terrified me. Not quite wolf, not quite human, but a nightmarish blend of both. And those eyes. They burned with an intelligence that was terrifyingly human, filled with a malevolence that froze the scream in my throat. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, we stared at each other. I could see my own terror reflected in those savage eyes, could almost sense the creature's satisfaction at the fear it inspired. Then, with a speed that should have been impossible for something so large, it moved. One moment it was at the edge of the clearing, the next it was right in front of me. A massive paw swiped through the air, and I felt rather than saw my camera torn from my grasp. The device went flying, disappearing into the underbrush with a crash. That sound broke the spell of terror that had held me frozen. I screamed, the sound tearing from my throat with a force that surprised even me. It echoed through the trees, a primal cry of terror that seemed to startle even the werewolf. I didn't wait to see its reaction. Pure animal instinct took over, and I ran. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me at every step. But I didn't slow down, couldn't slow down. To stop was to die. Behind me I heard the sound of pursuit. Heavy footfalls, snapping branches, that bone-chilling growl growing ever closer. I ran harder than I ever had in my life, my lungs burning, legs trembling with exertion and fear. I had no idea where I was going. All sense of direction was lost in the blind panic of flight. I only knew I had to get away, had to find safety somewhere in this endless expanse of trees and shadows. Time lost all meaning. I could have been running for minutes or hours. My world narrowed to the pounding of my heart, the gasping of my breath, and the terrible sounds of pursuit behind me. But gradually, I realized something. The sounds were growing fainter. The creature wasn't gaining on me, it was falling behind. Hope surged through me, giving me a fresh burst of energy. I pushed myself harder, ignoring the burning in my muscles, the stitch in my side. Just a little further, just a little longer. And then, suddenly, the trees thinned out. I burst out of the forest onto a gravel road, the sudden openness almost dizzying after the close confines of the woods. I risked a glance over my shoulder. The tree line was dark and still. No sign of pursuit. No glowing eyes or massive shape emerging from the shadows. But I didn't stop running. I couldn't. The memory of those teeth, those claws, drove me onward. I followed the road, praying it would lead to civilization, to safety. As I ran, the realization of what had just happened began to sink in. I had seen it again. The werewolf was real, undeniably real, and I had nothing to show for it. No photo, no evidence, just my own terrified testimony that no one would believe. Tears streamed down my face, a mix of fear, frustration, and utter exhaustion. But I kept running, kept moving forward. Because somewhere behind me, in the dark heart of the forest, a monster lurked. And I knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The first light of dawn found me huddled in the hollow of a massive fallen tree, my body trembling from exhaustion and residual terror. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of fear through me. I couldn't shake the feeling that those yellow eyes were still out there, watching, waiting. As the forest slowly came to life around me, birds cautiously beginning their morning songs, I forced myself to move. My muscles screamed in protest, stiff from hours of immobility and the frantic run for my life. But I couldn't stay here. I had to go back, had to see if there was anything left of my campsite, any shred of evidence to prove what had happened. The journey back was a nightmare of paranoia. Every shadow seemed to hide a monstrous shape, every sound a potential threat. By the time I stumbled into the clearing where I'd set up camp, the sun was well above the horizon, casting a deceptively cheerful light on the scene of destruction before me. My tent lay in tatters, shredded beyond recognition. The contents of my backpack were strewn across the forest floor, torn and scattered. But it was the absence that hit me hardest. My camera, my one chance at proof, was nowhere to be found. No, I whispered, dropping to my knees. No, no, no. I searched frantically, crawling through the underbrush, praying to find the camera or even just a piece of it. But there was nothing. No claw marks on the trees, no massive paw prints in the soft earth. It was as if the creature had never been there at all. As the reality of my situation sank in, a hysterical laugh bubbled up in my throat. Who would believe me now? I had nothing to show for my terrifying ordeal but my own wild-eyed testimony. With shaking hands, I gathered what remained of my belongings. I couldn't stay here. I had to report this, had to try one last time to make someone understand the danger lurking in these woods. The drive to the ranger station felt surreal. The world looked so normal, so peaceful. How could everything just go on as if nothing had happened? Ranger Mike Stevens was behind the desk when I stumbled in, his eyebrows rising at my disheveled appearance. "Mr. Johnson?" he said, concern and wariness warring in his voice. "What happened to you?" The words poured out of me in a frantic rush. I told him everything: the destroyed campsite, the howl that shattered the night, the terrifying chase through the dark forest. As I spoke, I could see the shift in Stephen's expression, from concern to skepticism to barely concealed irritation. "Let me get this straight," he said when I finally ran out of words. "You went back out there alone after everything you claimed happened before, and now you're saying this creature attacked you again?" "I know how it sounds," I said, my voice cracking. "But I swear to you it's true. You have to believe me." Stephen sighed, rubbing his temples. "Mr. Johnson, we've been through this. There are no werewolves in these mountains. What you experienced was likely a bear encounter, exaggerated by fear and the darkness." "A bear?" I laughed, the sound edged with hysteria. "A bear didn't do this. A bear doesn't stand 7 feet tall on its hind legs with glowing yellow eyes." "Enough," Stephen said, his tone hardening. "I've humored you because I understand you've been through something traumatic. But this has gone too far. You put yourself and potentially others in danger by going back out there alone." He leaned forward, his eyes locking with mine. "I'm going to say this one last time. There are no monsters in these woods. What you need is rest and probably some professional help to deal with what you've been through. Go home, Mr. Johnson, for your own sake." I opened my mouth to argue further, but the words died in my throat. The utter disbelief in Stevens's eyes told me it was useless. He would never believe me. No one would. In a daze, I walked out of the station and got into my car. As I pulled onto the highway, leaving the mountains behind, a numbness settled over me. I had seen something impossible, something terrifying. I knew the truth, but without proof, without evidence, that truth would die with me. Hours passed in a blur as I drove, putting as much distance as I could between myself and those cursed woods. It wasn't until I crossed the state line that I finally allowed myself to relax slightly. At a red light, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The mountains were long out of sight, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something of them had followed me. Would I ever truly be free of the memory of those yellow eyes, those gnashing teeth? As I accelerated through the intersection, a chill ran down my spine. I may have escaped with my life, but a part of me knew this wasn't over. The werewolf was still out there, still hunting. And I was the only one who knew the truth. The weight of that knowledge settled heavily on my shoulders as I drove on into an uncertain future. I had survived my encounter with the impossible, but at what cost? And what would I do with the terrible truth I now carried? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain. I would never look at the darkness the same way again.